Why is it that it was so much more difficult with seed and crops compared with medical biotechnology?
Because people, by and large, don't have any comment to make about the medicines which are prescribed to them. When you go to the doctor and the doctor says you ought to have so-and-so, you don't argue with him. And if he says you need insulin and the insulin comes from a genetically modified yeast or bacterium, you take it. You don't start raising philosophical objections. And although I have to tell you that in Germany, I believe, when genetically modified insulin was first put on the market, there were objections. And people were not allowed to make it in Germany, and they imported it from Denmark or Holland, perhaps. That died down in due course, but there are people who make it their business to raise objections in public for various reasons, and people get influenced by that.
So which were the main crops that the large companies chose to develop, and why did they choose those particular crops?
Well, as I explained, the large companies who started out faced the question at the beginning that they didn't know whether they would succeed, they didn't know how much difficulty they would have and how much it would cost. And remember that seed companies do not sell to you and me. Seed companies sell essentially to farmers. And so they develop products for their clients, and their clients were farmers. So what they needed was products, first of all, which they were capable of making, capable of thinking of making, shall I say, when they started in the early 80s, I would guess. We've just said there's just been a celebration of 30 years of plant GM, so we can date it to around 1982, was when they first started doing this. Their clients were farmers, and therefore they were alert to the needs of farmers, and they knew that if they developed successful products, they knew how to sell them, because they sold to farmers. That's where they did their business. And there are things that farmers always need. Farmers always need ways of dealing with weeds, because weeds are always with us. Need ways of dealing with pests, because those are always with us too. And then they have to cope with matters of fertilizing and providing nutrients to the soil. And so all these sorts of things were familiar matters to the seed manufacturers. So not surprisingly, therefore, they developed products for their own market.
But which were the crops that they chose?
Oh, the crops were commodity crops, large-scale commodity crops. They didn't go for lettuces and cucumbers. The markets are too small. They went for soybeans and for maize and for cotton. Those are very big global crops which have very large production levels, and which are bought by lots of people and grown by lots of people. And then later on they added oilseed rape, particularly in Canada. The Canadians call it canola. But that was the other big one. And those have remained the biggest crops, largely because of the problems developing others. And the question is whether the markets are worth the effort for smaller varieties. So people have done other things, but those have remain the main ones.
But the main thing that would make it crops more acceptable to consumers is if you had better qualities, better eating qualities perhaps, in terms of lettuces and tomatoes and cucumbers.
Well, it's an interesting question about what makes things acceptable to consumers, and that depends, I suppose, to a degree on what consumers are told about things. For example, new models of car are produced every year, but nobody goes out and asks the consumers whether they're ready for these new cars. You put them on the market, and either they buy them or they don't. And this is a very different technology, and this is one technology where you can't put it on the market and test it, because you have to go through all sorts of hurdles before you're allowed to do that. So it's a strange business model compared with the usual sorts of innovation. So innovation generally takes place by the innovators deciding to innovate and offering their innovation to the market for the market to buy or not as it chooses. Obviously they try and do their best to get them to do so. And here they're not allowed to. So it's a very odd situation.
What do you see as the actual benefits and the potential benefits of GM technology?
Well, there are some obvious benefits, and they've clearly been beneficial for those people who've taken them up, because there are believed to be something like 13 or 14 million farmers around the world who are now using this material, many of them in the poorer countries. In fact, the rate of growth in the poorer countries is now greater than that in the industrial countries, and has been for some years. So since they come back every year, and since the numbers grow every year, they presumably see advantage in what they're doing, or they're very stupid. And I don't believe that 30 million people are consistently so stupid as to just make money for the seed supply, so presumably they get an advantage. Well, the advantages are clear enough. one major aspect of this technology, one major application of this technology so far has been in the control of weeds. That's the glyphosate. And it's done by making the crop plant resistant to the action of the weed killer, whereas the weeds themselves are susceptible. So that means that you can spray with the weed killer on top of the crop plants because the crop plants are resistant, whereas normally they would also be sensitive. So then you have to spray very carefully and make sure you aim your nozzles and whatever. And you also have to spray more often. So what this enabled people to do was to use much less spray because they could wait until late in the season before they sprayed to get rid of the weeds. They didn't have to start spraying early on. They used a weed killer glyphosate called Roundup in the trade, which is relatively innocuous as these things go. And it had actually been on sale and in garden centres for 40 years, I think, something like that. So people are very used to it and are very comfortable using it. It's not one of the nasties. And it was extremely effective. Not perfectly effective, nothing's perfect, but it was extremely effective. So that was one thing they did. And because weeds compete with crop plants, and if you're not careful, the weeds will overgrow the crop plants and you will reduce your yield. You have a choice. You either control the weeds and get the crops, but you have effort and expense in controlling the weeds. You know, either you get out on your hands and knees or with a hoe and do it, or you use some chemical way of doing it, or you don't control the weeds and you suffer the loss of yield. That's a choice that farmers make, and most farmers will go for the weeds and keep the yields up. So in that case, if you have an easier way of weed control, you'll get better yields. And the second major type of GM crop in use is the insect-resistant maize and cotton. And there was very considerable damage in some susceptible areas where the insects existed, cutting down the yields of the maize and the cotton because the insects destroyed the plants. So the yields went down. Farmers had to use insecticides to control them, to attempt to control them. Insecticides are poisonous. Poor farmers who were using backpack sprays had a high rate of illness, death from using these sprays. So that's been largely reduced, not cut out, but largely reduced. The amount of such sprays has gone down enormously in those areas, and the damage is much less than it was. Not nothing, but much less than it was. And one of the points about using this technique is the realization that in biology, if you perturb the system, it is likely to react. And so if you kill the insects with a poison of some sort, in this case a poison which was actually placed inside the plant, we can talk about that poison in a minute, then one of the possible reactions is that in time you will get insects resistant to that poison. I mean, it's just a characteristic of biology, you know, it always happens that you prod it somewhere, it'll prod back at you. And so there was an understanding from the very beginning that this might happen. And so the people who designed the systems suggested, in fact required, I think, that the people using these insect-resistant strains left patches of the original crop at intervals, and there was a proportion prescribed, 10% or 20% or whatever it may be, depending on conditions, in which the insects would be safe. And the idea being, therefore, that most of the insects in the neighbourhood, therefore, would come from these patches, that if a resistant one should arise from the treated plants, they would likely mate with one which was susceptible and get clonked. And so it was a way of reducing, perhaps even eliminating, although you could never be sure of that, reducing at least minimising the outcome of the rising of resistant form. And it's been remarkably successful.
And this is widely practiced, is it?
Well, it should be widely practiced. It is widely practiced in countries which are well controlled. Whether it is also widely practiced in other countries is more difficult to say.
And this is where the dangers can come in, where you can get the build-up of resistance.
That's right. And so in the US, and I guess in much of, in the US and where they grow a lot of this stuff, it is well controlled. the government agencies make sure that the things are done properly. And these resistant mazes have been in use now for 15, 16 years. And I think there's only been an occasional report of a resistant insect, so they're rare. So the system has worked, not perfectly, because biology never works perfectly, but it's worked remarkably well. And one of the things which is, again, very characteristic for all human activity and all technologies is no technology is born perfect. And we always learn to manage it and improve it with use and experience. And these technologies, these biological ones, were actually born in a remarkably healthy condition, but of course they have improved as time goes on. Now, if I'm wandering on too long, tell me, but one of the interesting points about this is that there is also, to some degree, the development of glyphosate-resistant weeds. And one of the reasons for that is because there is not enough variety in weed-resistant strains which have been developed. And the reason is because there has been so much opposition and because the price has become so high that the companies have not developed as many different sorts of weed resistance as they might have done had conditions been a lot better. So opposition is cutting its own throat.
How can you get round that then? Because surely it's going to become self-defeating and you're going to have to go on using more pesticides to overcome the resistance.
Yes, I think in many ways the whole problem comes down to the regulatory system. How can we make the regulatory system, particularly in Europe, more sensible, more receptive, more responsive? And that in turn depends on the political scene and the politicians' perception of public interest, public opinion. I say politicians' perception because it's not clear, at any rate to me, that the public actually thinks the way politicians think the public thinks. And so it's the perception of public interest and public opinion rather perhaps than public opinion itself.
So you said before that the crops are now grown on a huge scale. What's sort of the area of crops and which countries are they actually grown in on a very large scale?
Oh, if you want numbers, I seem to remember a number like 130 million hectares, but it doesn't mean a lot to me, I must say. A much easier number to gather, to get your head around, is about 10% of all arable crops are now GM. Do you know what arable crops are? Arable crops are ones which are sown, as distinct from orchards, which are planted.
So we're talking about cereals and, soybeans.
Yes, and cucumbers and tomatoes.
Are not counted, no, yes, I understand.
So cucumbers and tomatoes are counted. All things which you plant, as it were, in rows. But orchards are not counted, and of course grassland is not counted, so cattle racing on grassland is not counted. So it's cereals and vegetables and...
But in fact, what you did say was that GM crops are not, there are no GM modified vegetables at the moment.
There are GM peppers in China. I think there are not many. I think people have designed them, but the expense of getting them through the regulation is so great that the market doesn't warrant it. That's the problem with it. But there was a very noticeable case with papayas, and this was in one of the Hawaiian Islands where papayas are grown. They were subject to a disease called ring spot, which is a virus disease which was threatening to wipe out the whole industry in that island. And so the farmers, in some organisational sense, approached Cornell University in New York State, I think in the late 90s, asking them to see whether they could develop a virus-resistant strain of papaya, which eventually they did. Those papayas are now grown on that island. They're on sale as fruits, as whole fruits in the United States. And I think recently I heard that Japan is importing them. And so that was an example where it was worthwhile, but that was done through a university, and I don't know any of the details of how the regulation worked, because the regulation in the United States is a sensible one, where they regulate the product and not the process. So they look at the product and say, is the product okay? In that case, you're okay. Here we don't do that. Here we say, how did you make it if you made it like that?
So which are the biggest countries now, the biggest producers of GM crops?
United States, Brazil, Argentina, I suppose, by size are the biggest.
And I believe China and India.
Yes, I don't know. Well, India doesn't produce food. India produces only cotton. I don't know. China produces a lot of cotton. In fact, You know, there are very interesting stories about, let me tell you 3 stories, they're all related stories, that the Chinese went for GM cotton early on and were very successful. And the Indians saw the cotton market, their share of the cotton market collapsing, so they forced their reluctant government to allow them to grow GM cotton in order that they can compete with Chinese cotton. In South America, Argentina took to GM soybeans very early and very enthusiastically. Argentina is now said to be about 100% GM soybeans. Brazil, on the other hand, was much more reluctant. And so Brazilian farmers in the south of Brazil would go across the border into Argentina, buy GM seeds, grow them in Brazil and take them back to Argentina to sell. And the Brazilian government got hot under the collar and forbade it, but it carried on until about 2005-ish. They said, okay, you can do it for a year, and then the next year they said, okay, you can do it for another year, and then they said, okay, you can do it. And so now Brazil is approaching, I don't know, 90% GM soya as they produce the strains which will grow further and further north, closer and closer to the equator where it gets hotter. It takes time to do that. So Brazil is growing ever more GM. And the third example was France, where again Spain grew GM maize and France did not. So the French farmers in the south went across the border into Spain, got the seeds, grew the maize, took it back into Spain to sell. And eventually the French government said, okay, you can. And they started to do it in, again, about 2005, 2006, something like that. And then in 2008, President Sarkozy forbade it. Illegally, it turns out, according to all the court decisions, but I'm afraid the French government still forbade it and still maintains the ban illegally. And so French farmers, many of them, much to their annoyance, are no longer allowed to grow.
But there are some crops, GM crops, grown in Europe. What are they?
Well, there's only one crop which is grown, which is maize, and it's grown largely in Spain, and I think in Portugal, and in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. There was some grown in Germany, but I think there isn't any more. There might have been, that's probably about it. There's no point in growing it in Britain because it's an insect-resistant maize and we don't have the insect, so there's no advantage in growing it here.
So are there any GM crops being grown in Britain?
Not commercially.
Not commercially.
Because that maize is the only one approved in the European Union and it's simply not appropriate to grow it in this country. There's no insect, the insects are not here, and therefore the maize would be of no advantage to British farmers. British farmers say they would like to grow GM crops, but they want to grow GM crops which are appropriate for Britain.